Today, we are very lucky to have Professor Lucia Carminati from the University of Oslo. She is going to be talking about Egypt's borders. And you will see that themes emerge in the context of our papers. She's going to look at the period between 1875 and 1937. She herself is part of the archaeology and history department at the University of Oslo, so she relates to more than just borders, clearly, in terms of her expertise. Her bio is online, so you can look at her distinguished career going through the Mohamed Ali Foundation pages. I will introduce the other speakers when the turn comes. Dr. Lee, you're very welcome. You're sitting here patiently waiting to go next, and then we shall have Dr. Lamprakis, who will follow up the third. We'll have a break after the two first papers, and then we'll have Dimitris at the end. We'll have Q&A after each paper, and then hopefully there'll be a wider range of discussion to be had. We can have it with the three members of the panel at the end, if that's all right. So Lucia is going to speak for about 45 minutes on Egypt's borders, and then we'll have time for discussion. Very welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, without further ado, I'll move on and introduce my paper. But first, I want to thank the foundation. I want to thank Francis Gatto and the wonderful archivists working at Green Palace, or Palace Green, I should say, rather. So thank you very much for choosing my application and allowing me to work in this wonderful context. Our story for today has to do with border lines, border pillars, cartographic choices, maps, those who lived along such borders, and lines used to set apart people and places. It is an inquiry into what we think we know about borders and what border making actually meant and entailed. According to conventional accounts of modern Middle East history, international borders were introduced after the First World War as artificial, West-imposed boundaries, partitions that brought closure via diplomatic means to an intrinsically unstable region. The outbreak of the first global conflict was seen as the roadblock that brought to an end an age of unfettered movements for all, something that some have gone so far as to term the first wave of globalization. In this light, border formation in the modern Middle East has been first mostly studied through the lenses of political history. Second, such studies have been informed by assumptions of the primacy of the Western European nation-state model. However, while the role of colonialism, or imperialism, I should say, in imposing such model in the region needs to be acknowledged, European colonial powers were not simply making borders in the non-Western world at whim. To show this is the goal of my paper, which relies on the Durham University Library Archives and Special Collections, including the papers of Abbas Elmi II and the General Wingate papers. Egypt is determinable with unusual ease and little or no dispute. This is what a scholar argued in 1972 to prove mainly that such geographical or territorial factor greatly facilitated the rise of Egyptian national consciousness. Such a concept, as my colleague Matthew Ellis brilliantly expounded in his groundbreaking history of Egypt's western border, which also relies, among other archives, on the collections housed here at Durham, this was a long-lived idea that has had harmful effects on later historiography. The scholarship produced in Egypt has approached the country's territoriality as untouchable, something timeless, not to be questioned. Western scholarship has ironically achieved much of the same goal by interrogating national subjectivity, but taking for granted the territorial dimension of Egypt's nation statehood. Studies such as the ones brought forward by the scholars, including Ellis, that my colleague Mohamed Gamal ad-Din and I brought together in a roundtable published by the International Journal of Middle East Studies in 2021, these scholars have finally begun to chip away at the Cairo and Alexandria-centered histories of modern Egypt by exploring new geographies, new chronologies, new source bases. But even then, with Egypt's secondary cities or its agricultural interior coming into sharper relief, Ellis, again, is right in saying that the country's expansive desert borderlands are still neglected. The specific borderland I want to discuss today is what Rashid Khalidi in 1980 called Egypt's ill-defined eastern frontier with Syria. And I'm trying to change the slide. Let's see, yes. So this is purposefully chosen as a map with absolutely clear boundaries and even signaled by different colors, but that's a choice that I will explain in a minute. So the line in this map from 1918 appears very linear and absolutely neat, the border between Egyptian and its neighbors. So in these surroundings, in January 1906, a protracted dispute between the British, who had been by then occupying Egypt for 24 years, and the Ottomans, who were still the nominal sovereigns of Egypt, took place. This was to be designated alternatively as the Taba Affair or the Aqaba Incident. The ways in which such boundary would be called, was it an administrative line, was it an international border, and where exactly it ran, of course, mattered highly. So these issues will be discussed in further detail below. But for now, I want to emphasize that the history of such frontier was shaped so much by the interactions with people on the ground as it was by decisions taken in London, in Cairo, or in Istanbul. Do people make borders? How does their sheer presence, collaboration, or obstruction affect border-related decisions? What was entailed in the physical creation of such borders, and what material effects did border making produce? Such questions change the chronology and the focus that are prevalent in the available literature. Almost all previous writers who've dealt with Egypt's northeastern boundary in Sinai have approached it as the antechamber of British First World War diplomacy or the later history of Mandate Palestine and Israel. Moreover, conventional accounts of the 1906 affair end with the Ottoman Sultan, giving in to the British ultimatum, perhaps because writers tend to rely mostly on the published British diplomatic documents. Actually, disagreements over the Sinai frontier had been going on before 1906. They continued after that date and involved others other than the British and the Ottoman bureaucrats dispatched on the spot. The setting for what would later be known as the Aqaba or Taba incident was described in an 1887 travel account produced by a British as an arid wilderness, captured in this photograph from the Akasa Photography Archive. This territory was comprised between the cultivated lands of the Egyptian Delta and the hill country of Palestine, and was bounded on the north by the Mediterranean Sea, on the southwest by the Gulf of Suez, and on the southeast by the Gulf of Aqaba. The land differed as it comprised the semi-fertile portions about the southern end of Palestine, the arid tablelands of the Tih, the sandy dunes about the coast of the Mediterranean and the Suez Canal, and the mountainous district of the peninsula of Sinai. The latter, the Sinai, could be discerned from the sea a few hours of navigation south of Suez, even though it remained difficult to point out exactly which peak could be regarded as Mount Sinai specifically. There were water springs, there could be trees, such as eucalyptus trees, for example. The recently created Suez Canal, represented here in this map from 1861, and by the red line cutting the isthmus in north-south direction, the creation of the Suez Canal had effects on the Sinai that have been so far understated. First, it may have brought some clarity to the definition of the eastern boundary of Egypt, as it is suggested by this other map that I'm sharing with you, where the red line actually coincides with the Suez Canal. When Egyptian geographer Amin Fikri in 1879 described Egypt's borders, he was not thinking of the Sinai when he wrote that the natural borders of the land of Egypt, and I'm quoting, are to the east, the Gulf of Suez and the Red Sea, to the west is the Libyan desert, and to the south is the lands of Nubia. Scholars have noted the canal's potentially transformative role in border making only in passing. But the canal did function as the brand new and man-made eastern boundary for the so-called Egyptian territory. Once completed, the canal could only be crossed at Alcantara and with some degree of difficulty and slowdown when a simple ferry service was installed. As argued by my colleague, historian Valeska Huber, crossing the canal at Kantara, the point where the Suez Canal cut through the old caravan route between Cairo and Damascus, significantly hampered down Bedouin mobility and slowed down caravan trajectories. Moreover, the Suez Canal affected Sinai insofar it tended to replace the older overland pilgrimage routes with quicker and easier maritime travel, with implications that I will go into later. When it came to the canal's eastern flank, however, the Suez Canal could not delineate much, could not achieve much. There, the Egyptian territory and the Ottoman territory actually almost faded into one another. The above-mentioned 1887 travel account underlined that the Egyptian-Ottoman boundary did not appear to have been clearly defined by treaty or otherwise. Such an uncertainty, the author ominously added, may at some future period be a source of difficulty leading to a conflict of jurisdiction. The blank expanses, going back to this map, these blank expanses captured in this cartographic rendition are misleading. There were still routes and inhabitants. The so-called Darb al-Hajj, for example, to Mecca, connected Suez and Aqaba. Al-Arish figured as an important stepping stone for the caravans of pilgrims and merchants coming from Aleppo, Damascus, and Gaza, and moving on. Moreover, this region, even though thinly, was still inhabited by the Greek Orthodox monks of the St. Catherine's Monastery on Mount Sinai and by nomadic tribes, collectively referred to as Arabs or Bedouins. Since the time of Muhammad Ali, Bedouins had enjoyed many so-called special privileges, having become tantamount to guards and fortresses over the Egyptian frontiers. And I'm quoting again my colleague Matthew Ellis. As suggested by him, the Bedouin tribes of the Eastern Desert, as opposed to the Western Desert, which he has studied more closely, played a particularly crucial role given the Sinai's historical importance as a strategic crossroads between Egypt and the Mashriq and its location along the pilgrimage route to Mecca. The pilgrimage road was in fact divided into different segments and each fell under a different tribe's responsibility. Prior to the 1870s, and just let me remind you that the Suez Canal was inaugurated in 1869, prior to the 1870s, historian Nora Barakat has recently shown, Ottoman lawmakers had administered the corridor of the pilgrimage route in the Syrian interior closely through a wide network of lasting relationships with particular Bedouin groups. The Ottoman regime, she clarifies, had not attempted to directly govern the landscapes beyond that. Up to the opening of the canal in 1869, Egypt's administration of the overland pilgrimage routes along the Sinai coast was a convenience to both Cairo and Istanbul. Yet this alone could not entitle Egypt to rule the whole Sinai Peninsula alone. The Bedouin tribes who inhabited the deserts of both Sinai and Palestine, in fact, acknowledged Ottoman sovereignty. At the same time, the Bedouins of Sinai acknowledged Muhammad Ali's authority and were punished whenever they disobeyed him. The Egyptian army occupied 5 forts throughout the Sinai, and the strength of the Egyptian government representation in this region was proportional to the requirements of the annual pilgrimage In a nutshell, the Sinai was by no means a no man's land. When Britain occupied Egypt in 1882, for reasons that I will not get into now, but the situation changed for both the Suez Canal and the Sinai. The Anglo-Egyptian administration developed a vision for Sinai as a strategic barrier for the defense of the Suez Canal. Ottomans, on their part, also increased troops around Sinai. As argued by Bureaucrats, again, Ottoman sovereignty in the Syrian interior had become much more fraught after the double blow of loss of territory in the Balkans and the British presence in Egypt, which transformed Syria's southern, or the regions to the south of Syria, into a contested borderland. In the past, the Ottomans, as I explained, had allowed Egyptians to protect pilgrim caravans through the Sinai, but now the British were in control of Egypt, and it was too risky to leave the Egyptian army to their own devices, a point made by Matthew Ellis. In 1892, what could be labeled as the Anglo-Ottoman contest for Sinai began unfolding. That is when Khedive Tawfiq died suddenly, and his 17-year-old son, Abbas Hilmi II, succeeded to the Khedivate. And I apologize for using a photograph from another collection, but I thought that this was still interesting to include. According to Israel Gershoni, another historian of Egypt, Abbas Hilmi II tried to assert Egypt's unique status as a semi-autonomous province within the Ottoman Empire. But his aspirations clashed with those of the British agent and Consul General Evelyn Baring Lord Cromer, in office until 1907. Anti-imperialist Egyptians saw Abbas as a charismatic, independent leader ready to confront colonial rule. At the same time, however, Abbas was not easily manipulated by the Ottomans either. Seemingly, Abbas gave in to Abdul Hamid's, or the Ottoman Sultan's, request to give up Egypt's historic claim to garrison the villages on the pilgrimage road. However, the Sultan may have been wrong in assuming that the Khedive may surrender the whole of the Sinai altogether. Reportedly, the Ottoman Sultan saw an opportunity to obtain possession of a portion of the Sinai Peninsula. He, in fact, wished to draw a boundary line from Al-Arish on the Mediterranean coast to Suez on the Red Sea, on the head of the Gulf of Suez, in the north of the Red Sea. Lord Cromer, unsurprisingly, pushed back, insisting on a frontier that would instead be drawn from just east of Al-Arish to the head of the Gulf of Aqaba. The Ottoman authorities, and I'm showing you Aqaba, and you can see how the different lines diverged. At this point, the Ottoman authorities remained silent, neither agreeing nor objecting to Lord Cromer's pushback. This map, a key document, would have been crucial at this point, and it is the document, the map that I'm showing to you now, actually. A map, this key map, would have been a crucial document supporting the Ottoman position by showing that the Ottomans had never actually ceded the Sinai to Egypt. But it was nowhere to be found by the time this discussion was unfolding. This was the map that had been apparently included in the Firman that the Sultan had issued 50 years prior, in 1841, bestowing on Muhammad Ali the hereditary title of governor of Egypt within its known borders. Such map from 1841 would only later be found and reproduced in 1925, along with the official Western Border Treaty. And this is the reproduction that I'm sharing with you now, the one found in the 1925 treaty that was about a different borderland, but ironically also captured the borderland that I'm concerned about. But at this point, as suggested by Ellis himself, it was way too late for this map to have any significant impact on the border making in this region. So going back to the last decade of the 19th century, the Sinai issue, after the exchange I've described before happening in 1892, the Sinai issue lay more or less dormant, but Anglo-Ottoman relations growingly became more tense and colder. It would not long be, however, before a so-called nasty bother would develop in Sinai in 1905. And I'm sharing with you a citation from the Durham collections, in which is reported how this sentence that I'm using myself, a nasty bother would develop in Sinai in 1905. In fact, in late 1905, in fact, in January 1906, Sir Reginald Wingate, the person who was then the Governor General of the Sudan and Sirdar, or head of the Egyptian army, sent an order to the Director of Intelligence in Cairo to have this director's subordinate, called Wilfred Jennings Bramley, leave the headquarters of Nahl at the heart of the Sinai and proceed to Rashrash, which is contemporary Eilat in the Gulf of Aqaba, to build up a small post for the Egyptian border police. So unavoidably, this would be seen as a provocation. In later British documents, two reasons for this move are given. First, the murder of 2 Bedouins and the determination to bring security to the region. And second, the suspicion that the Ottomans, due to their desire to extend the Hijaz railway from Aqaba to Suez, were attempting to alter the status quo in the Sinai. And I'm glad that my colleague will be soon talking about the history of the railway, because it also touches on the issues that I'm discussing now, although I'm not getting into that aspect in detail. So in a nutshell, a relatively remote and desertic location on the Sinai eastern coast had quickly become the fulcrum, the point of convergence of local, regional, and global concerns. The echo of the tension mounting in late 1905, early 1906, loudly reverberated in the correspondence between Abbas Hilmi II and Ahmad Rashid Bey, or Counselor of State and representative of the Khedive in Constantinople, through which I will recreate the series of events on the ground. And these papers are some of the papers that I've worked with here at Durham. On January 16, 1906, Rashid wrote, so the representative of the Khedive in Constantinople, reported back that the port was in constant and coded correspondence with the governor of Syria on the subject of Aqaba, where Ramli Bey, an Englishman in the service of the government of Your Majesty, led the works. And I may have this document reproduced here. Just a month later, in February, the so-called issue of Aqaba was still raising a lot of concern in Istanbul. In April 1906, the issue of Aqaba was always on the agenda. The Council of Ministries, the Ottoman Council of Ministries, had gathered and decided to stand firm and do not abandon anything, and I'm quoting. Come May 1906, the issue of Aqaba was still far from being liquidated, and a few days later, on May 8, the issue of the Egyptian border was taking a so-called disquieting turn. The British ambassador had given an energetic note demanding full satisfaction by May 15. In view of a naval demonstration, the British fleet had received order to gather in the Piraeus, the harbor of Athens. It was said that a word of order had been given to the press of London, which struck me as a healthy reminder to the present-day historian to take whatever appeared on the press, not necessarily at face value. So the issue of Aqaba, as well as the delimitation of the Sinai Peninsula, was still on the agenda of the Ottoman Council of Ministers. And it seemed again in May 1906, that the final agreement with England, and I'm quoting, ran counter some difficulties. And difficult it was, very much so. The long-dragged dispute finally yielded a so-called agreement signed and exchanged at Rafah on the 1st of October 1906 between the representatives of the Ottoman Sultanate and the Egyptian Khedivate concerning the fixing of a separating administrative line between the vilayats of the Hijaz and the governorate of Jerusalem and the Sinai Peninsula. So the fact that such boundary would be called an administrative line is telling of Ottoman anxieties to avoid any impression that by signing the boundary agreement, they had agreed to the diminution or to the lessening of their sovereignty over Egypt. From the standpoint of Istanbul, in fact, now that the British were in charge of Egypt, a boundary treaty would be a disaster, tantamount to recognizing Egypt as a foreign country. What little negotiators could perhaps agree on pivoted on the departure and the arrival points of this line. At Rafah, local inhabitants and travelers alike considered two granite pillars, presumably one per each side, and a tree, a cedar tree, in between to act as a boundary marker. So these signs, these objects on the land supposedly divided Asia from Africa and Syria from Egypt. Such pillars, as it emerges from papers here at the in Durham from the Wingate collection, these pillars had inscriptions on them. In January 1907, so 2 months after the agreement was finalized, a British official reported that the Ottomans had broken the Egyptian pillar, yet photographic evidence of this inscription had apparently survived, but did not actually make it to the archives, unfortunately. So the Ottomans broke this pillar, perhaps in spite. And that regards the so-called point of departure. When it comes to the point of arrival, they may have agreed on the surroundings of Aqaba, or Ayla of ancient times, where the 4 administrative districts of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and Arabia met. Yet, what trajectory to embark on from point A to point B was far from being squarely settled. In an Ottoman map from 1906, and which was presumably used during the negotiations, several lines can be seen. First and foremost, the dashed red line proposed by the Ottoman delegates, the dashed green line proposed by the Anglo-Egyptian delegates, that eventually was very similar to the line eventually adopted in the 1906 agreement. Roads were included, and so were villages and permanent water sources. And I will be also discussing what else was included in this map in a little bit. First, I wanted to describe what emerges from the Durham papers in terms of border making, the actual material practices of erecting these barriers, these signs on the land that were supposed to act as barriers. So more pillars, besides the ones that I've showed before, were erected to delineate the boundary line. The inspector of Sinai himself had negotiated with apparently reluctant Ottoman authorities, one of them hindering the talks to the point of gaining the ungainly insult of, and I'm quoting, silly, hysterical old woman, which apparently functioned as an insult. So the disagreements had to do about the height of the pillars, but eventually the parties agreed on a height of 6 feet, if no more than 2 kilometers apart. And if farther than that, the pillars would be 8 feet high. Apparently, the ongoing British-Ottoman discussions also involved establishing a telephone line along the border and the establishment of posts, which I'm supposing and I'm speculating that it's meant military posts along the line. Getting the pillars in place was called frontier post work, was entrusted to the care of a certain Ismail Effendi, and took some time to be completed. It was an apparently lengthy procedure. When pillars were in place, British personnel would follow. Most would be accommodated in tents. Whenever there was no water, sinking a well would have to start in earnest to avoid the considerable cost of carrying water from a long distance for the well party. So well after October 1906, the border, or the making of the border, continued to raise controversies. The Durham papers help us clarify that. The Ottomans, on their part, feared that the British, if strengthened in the Sinai, might incite Bedouin raids against the new line. The British, on their part, viewed a project of a line, or feared, interpreted whatever Ottoman moves as advances towards the Suez Canal. The British worried about spies, such as the two alleged German travelers crossing Sinai in 1907, wandering along near the frontier, gathering information on roads, on water supplies. These all emerges from the papers here in Durham. In its richness, and I want to bring up again the map that I've discussed before. In its richness, the Ottoman map from 1906 also included people, such as the Bedouin tribes of the Tarabin in northern Sinai and the Hewat in southern Sinai, which I've marked here with these two circles. The Tarabin of northern Sinai, for example, recognized Ottoman sovereignty. The bounds of their living area had been known to separate the Egyptian administration from the Ottoman administration of southern Palestine. In spite of the straight Al-Arish Aqaba line cherished or wanted by the British, the Ottoman government still exercised at least nominal control over some tribes of Bedouins to the west of this line. In other cases, such line fell right through across the area inhabited by the same Bedouin groups, straddling both sides of the boundary then, such as the Tiaha. So the British arranged for Bedouins in these regions to be counted just 2 months after the signing of the agreement over the administrative line. As noted by Valeska Huber, Western travelers and observers literally abhorred or feared or looked down upon the Bedouins and their apparently uncontrollable way of life, yet liked to classify them and capture them in these cameos for their seemingly mysterious and exotic lifestyle. Why exactly would the British want to achieve knowledge over the volume, the composition of such population? The Durham papers can, again, help us attempt an explanation of this. The person who was then Inspector of Sinai, Jennings Bramley, was at first involved in this task, and Wingate expected him to do exceedingly well. In addition to the special work of counting, Bramley was, first of all, and I'm quoting, in a position to collect a large amount of valuable information about manners, customs, the strength of the various tribes, of which Wingate himself admitted the British were rather ignorant. Both surveillance and taxation, of course, came into the picture. First, the documents explicitly reveal that the British feared that the Bedouins, especially those living on the Turkish side, could spy out the land on behalf of the Ottomans. Moreover, and this is where taxation comes into play, the available data may have been skewed, and that's why the British wanted to collect new data. The available data may have been skewed since many fellahin, or Egyptian farmers, may have been included in the counts of the Bedouins. However, as the British themselves recognized, these sedentary people had been accepted for years as Bedouins, at least in northern Sinai. On the one hand, it would seem absurd to pinpoint exactly on a map where nomadic people resided. Such was at least what a geographic dictionary published in Cairo in 1899, what it attempted to achieve. So this would seem absurd, but on the other, there was a higher degree of proximity than fathomed by cartographic renditions. As an observer wrote in 1887, the same that I've mentioned before, tribal grounds were interlaced, and in many parts of the country, detachments of several tribes were found amicably living near the same waters. So the Bedouins, at least those in northern Sinai, objected to having their census taken. The sheikh reacted by declaring pretty straight that they won't be counted. British authorities dispatched in the Sinai met with at least 5 sheikhs to try to come to some arrangement, dampen their suspicions, and guarantee no intention of taxation or military service. The tribal leaders, some of whom are depicted in this picture, which unfortunately is a little bit out of the position where it was supposed to be. But the tribal leaders could not conceive that government wished to count them without some ulterior motive in mind. They adduced this to the ignorance of their Arabs, and I'm quoting, but they themselves may have been just as much, if not more, opposed to the census. Overall, as it had become clear to the British, sending inspectors out of towns to make a count in that way of the Bedouins was not only futile, but dangerous, especially when, and I'm quoting, Arabs in out-of-the-way spots may end beating them up. So surveillance, taxation, as well as military service were then well within the horizon of Bedouin concerns. Conscription had been attempted before. Muhammad Ali had mobilized the Bedouin in support of his wars. When the canal was inaugurated around 1869, one specific tribe inhabiting the Sinai Peninsula had been ordered to assist in guarding the Suez Canal. And when they refused, they actually paid for it with the imprisonment of their leader, of their head. After 1882, there's evidence that the British still regarded these Bedouins as potentially magnificent soldiers, granted that they applied to the discipline that was expected of them. Eventually, the British authorities in the Sinai still planned to come to some rough count of the Arabs before the end of 1907, not by actual counting them, but by questioning the various sheikhs and checking their statements by the opinions of others. And I'm quoting, "The Director General of the Census himself intervened by actually requesting an accurate census and sending in forms to be filled out. He pressed to be given the best possible estimate of all Arabs, including men, women, and children. Roughly, the outcome was 12,710 men, to whom a rough count of 1 woman and 2 children per each man was to be added. And yet, the later governor of Sinai, in the 1920s to 1936, he himself had to admit, and I'm quoting, everything outside the cultivation of the Nile was an unknown quality as far as real survey work was concerned." So what strategies did Bedouins adopt in the face of such unrelenting effort to collect an only apparently harmless large amount of valuable information? And by the way, the Ottomans, as Noura Barakat has clearly documented, did not stay idle in this regard and made also similar efforts in that sense. So it's not only a British story. We see here, as I said, some of the heads of these tribal groups. First of all, they petitioned that a general and not a detailed census be taken. Second, they tried to set the terms on who would be appointed to carry out such work. They declared that they did not want Bedouin enthusiast Jennings Bromley out in the provinces. When offended, Bromley threatened resignation. His higher-ups dismissively declared he ought not to consider himself indispensable. By then, he was said to be, and I'm quoting from the Durham papers, he was said to be a good little chap and smart, but pig-headed. Possibly the Bedouins may have been in the habit of actually pulling his leg a bit. Third, when in February 1907, the British authorities in the Sinai told the so-called natives of Al-Arish, many of whom appeared to be Bedouins, when the British authorities in Sinai told these residents, these natives of Al-Arish, that they wanted to count the trees within the end of the year and hinted at future taxes to come their way, the interested parties quickly saw to that. 103 people bypassed the local British authority and petitioned Lord Cromer directly, which bespoke of either their distrust for the former or simply the urgency of the matter at hand. The authors of this petition described themselves as distressed at the news that they would have to pay taxes on our palm trees, to build dirt pits outside the town, pay for the rafirs or the guards. They continued claiming that they were very poor and not enjoying a citizen's life, always roaming about either in Egypt or Syria in search of food. They pleaded that taxes not be collected and that they would be allowed to live same as their forefathers before them for centuries. Finally, and this is actually the point, the most important point that I want to make today, and sorry for taking so much of your time, the Bedouins manipulated the line on the ground to their advantage by, for example, threatening to jump over to the other side. At least 2 instances of this emerge from the Durham archive. Some sheikhs of the Teaha tribe, who lived on the Turkish side of the so-called new boundary, declared that unless the boundary could be pushed further east, then they would come and settle into Egypt. In the opposite direction, some sheikhs warned if an attempt at counting was actually carried out, their Arabs, in spite of their apparent opposition, would stick up, upstick and move across the border for good. To such warning, British authorities were unsurprisingly upset and reacted by claiming it would be absurd that some tribes would have to abandon property while others would end up being dispossessed in their land and grazing by the arrival of the newcomers. Bedouins, in other words, made expert use of the new reality imposed by the coalescing border. They were aware of how potentially disruptive their numbers and movements could be for those authorities who were trying to get things straight, either on census forms or on maps. I'm approaching my conclusion by reminding us that previous scholarship theorized Egypt's Bedouins as settled by the start of the 20th century. In this reading, Egypt's increased cultivation and the growing railway, once again, had corralled nomads, had pushed them along the inevitable path that led to sedentarization, to settling down. Other scholars later qualified such view by showing actually the limited penetration of this state and the coexistence of state authorities with nomadic pastoralists. More recently, and in regards to the Syrian interior specifically, Eugene Rogan and Nora Barakat have pushed this interpretation even further by exploring the active involvement of Bedouins, or better, in Nora Barakat's words, Bedouin bureaucrats, into the creation of a state on the ground and in everyday life. So more needs to be done when it comes to the Sinai or Egypt's southern borders. These remain to be explored in future studies. So I follow the hint of these scholars that I've mentioned today, and that of others, including historian Yurdi Tegel, in attempting to show how border dwellers shaped their surroundings and affected choices that were made in the capitals. At the very least, they resisted the collection of information on them and their surroundings. The border region, as it was being traced on maps, remained mostly untractable in practice. The cadastral map that was realized by 1907, as a scholar of Egypt, Timothy Mitchell, has shown, did attempt to achieve colonial legibility. However, there would still be huge expanses of sort of white space on untouched paper up until the 1920s. At the same time, however, sort of a reminder is that concessions for land in the Sinai were being allotted, were being handed out, registered with the Ministry of Finance. Increasingly, forays were being made into researching Sinai's resources, including the mineral resources traced in a study from 1912, found at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So on the one hand, there were efforts underway to actually gather even more knowledge. However, as of 1931, a document from the Egyptian National Archives from Dar al-Wasa'if al-Qawmiyya reveals that the effective line of custom control would still stop at the western banks of the Suez Canal. It was to that day, to the early 1930s, still impossible to exercise any surveillance over the desertic region of the Sinai, where 5 different smuggling routes were in operation. So the modern idea of a territorial nation state that Arthur Goldschmidt, as one among other historians, this modern idea of a territorial nation state was being imposed on Middle Eastern governments, and possibly, I mean, definitely, this idea was taking strides at the turn of the century, even in relatively remote places, such as the ones I've described today. It dictated that the Sinai must be ruled by a specific nation state. But what I would like to show is also that the inhabitants of Sinai took the opportunities that came their way, tried to steer the boundary line, or threatened to migrate to move elsewhere. This is also part of the history of Egypt's making, and the history of the making of Egypt's borders and border dwellers demonstrate that Egypt never was a geographic given. These are my preliminary thoughts and findings, lines for future research. There's much more that needs to be done. But to borrow the voice of one of the inhabitants of your archive, if I may, I would love to end by justifying any flaws of this paper, where again I've presented only some of the initial findings for this new project, and say, forgive my writing, but I burnt my hand and I am a bit crippled. So thank you very much.